In Chapter 15, we'll be looking at the Reconstruction era and the South. And this really just refers to the process of bringing the South back into the United States after the Civil War was over. And Lincoln had a very generous plan for bringing the South back into the Union, but of course that was messed up when he was assassinated. And because Andrew Johnson was pretty much overpowered by Congress, they were harsh with the South, which caused increasing bitterness between the South and the North. So we will be looking at this era in Chapter 15. So we'll start this chapter with Lincoln's assassination. And I think the thing that people mostly don't realize about this is that it was a plot to completely decapitate the government. The plan was not only to take out the president, but also the vice president and the Secretary of State. And so after a very long meeting on April 14th, 1865, where Lincoln and his cabinet had discussed what the post-war settlement would be at considerable length, Lincoln thought he would take an evening off to relax by attending a play, Our American Cousin, where, of course, an actor named John Wilkes Booth slipped into the president's box, shot him in the back of the head while people were applauding, and he died the next morning. Well, again, this murder was a part of a plot for government decapitation, to take out the complete head of government, pretty much. And it was organized by diehard pro-Southerners. And so a guy named George Azerodt, maybe, was assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, but at the last minute he lost his nerve and pretty much just stayed in the hotel bar drinking instead. He was still tried and executed by hanging in July of the same year. And then Booth had assigned a guy named Lewis Powell to take out Secretary of State William Seward. And so he sort of went through with it. He entered Seward's home and he severely injured him and his son and a bodyguard, but he didn't kill them. And so he was tried and convicted and also executed by hanging in 1865. So after John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln on April 14th, 1865, the national mood hardened. But in spite of the amount of bloodshed, the Civil War caused less intersectional hatred than may have been expected. Animosity quickly subsided, and most of the Confederate leaders were only mildly punished. Even Jefferson Davis was arrested, and of course Northerners taunted him and said they'd hang him to a sour apple tree, but he was let go on bail and never tried. And other Southerners spent time in jail, but almost all of them were let go as well. So the treatment there really wasn't that harsh. The status of the Southern states, though, raised really complex legal questions about the process of readmitting them to the Union, because according to Southerners, they were out of the Union, so they would have to be readmitted. And so this process of readmission actually began in 1862, which that may sound weird because the war was still being fought then, but Lincoln had already appointed provisional governors for those areas of the South that had been occupied by federal troops. And so in December 1863, he issued a proclamation that provided that Southerners, with the exception of high Confederate officials, could reinstate themselves as U.S. citizens by simply taking a loyalty oath. And Lincoln came up with this plan. It's famously called the 10% plan. And it simply said a state could set up a government when a number equal to 10% of those who voted in 1860 took the loyalty oath. And this really revealed his lack of vindictiveness. He even stated, "We shall sooner have the fowl by hatching it than by smashing it." So this was Lincoln's very lenient and generous plan to readmit the South into the Union. So of course the radicals in Congress did not like Lincoln's plan, and they thought he was being too generous. So they passed the Wade-Davis bill instead. And this said that a majority of Southerners had to profess their loyalty to the Union, and the bill further required that states would prohibit slavery and renounce all Confederate debts. And Lincoln just pocket vetoed this bill. So after Johnson became president, he issued an amnesty proclamation that was only slightly more rigorous than Lincoln's. And so by the time Congress reconvened in December of 1865, all of the Southern states had organized governments, they had ratified the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, they had elected senators and representatives, and Johnson submitted the new governments to Congress. Okay, so that brings us to radical Republicans. Both radical and moderate Republicans wanted to protect the ex-slaves from exploitation by their former masters, and they wanted to guarantee their basic rights. Radicals took this a step further and wanted to demand full political equality. So a vote, a plot of land, public education, and moderates were not really willing to go that far. And so basically, between the moderate Republicans and the radical Republicans, they put in place a minimum set of demands that pretty much doomed Johnson's plan for Reconstruction. And on top of that, Republicans feared that the balance of power in Congress may swing back to the Democrats because the 13th Amendment had increased the South's congressional representation by negating the 3/5 compromise. So now, former slaves are no longer counted as 3/5 of a person, they were counted as a whole person, thus boosting their representation and boosting the amount of delegates that they would send to Congress. And so, in addition to that, Southern voters provoked Northern resentment by electing former Confederate leaders into office. And they also began to pass the Black Codes, which they were passed by Southern governments basically to control ex-slaves. And of course, this outraged the North. So because of all of this, congressional Republicans rejected Johnson's plan for Reconstruction, and instead they created their own committee on Reconstruction that would basically study the question of readmitting the Southern states and come up with a new set of standards for what it would take to bring them back into the Union. And Johnson further alienated Republicans in Congress because he vetoed an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau, which was created, of course, to help the former slaves come into society, and also the Civil Rights Act. But Congress overrode the veto on the Civil Rights Act, and therefore Congress, not the president, controlled Reconstruction from that point on. And just a side note, the Civil Rights Act really just worked to strengthen the 13th Amendment. Besides declaring specifically that blacks were citizens, it also denied states the power to restrict their rights, like testifying in court or to hold property or to make contracts for their labor. So really, it just strengthened the 13th Amendment. So in June 1866, Congress finally submitted the 14th Amendment to the states. And this was truly a radical measure. It granted blacks political rights, and in doing so, it expanded the power of the federal government really at the expense of the states. And in addition to that, it broadened the definition of citizenship and struck at discriminatory legislation like the Black Codes that had been implemented in the South in order to try to restrict the newly freed blacks. And it struck at the Black Codes by guaranteeing all citizens due process of law and equal protection under the law. And it attempted to force Southern states to permit blacks to vote. And those states that did not faced a reduction of their congressional representation. So, furthermore, the amendment barred former federal officials who had served the Confederate States of America from holding state or federal office until they officially received a pardon from the Congress. And so this was a really big amendment, And in the congressional elections of 1866, Johnson forced the issue of making people choose between the 14th Amendment and his policy, his own Reconstruction policy. And this failed dismally. And Republicans from all over were voted into office. And because of that, they won veto-proof majorities in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And furthermore, they gained control of all of the northern states. So the southern states refused to accept the 14th Amendment, and their refusal led to the passage of the first Reconstruction Act in March 1867, and this was passed over Johnson's veto. And this law divided the South into 5 military districts, which were commanded by a military officer with extensive powers to protect the civil rights of all people and to maintain order. To end military rule, Southern states had to adopt new constitutions that both guaranteed the blacks the right to vote and would disenfranchise many ex-Confederates. And the new state governments also had to ratify the 14th Amendment. And once they did those things, then martial law in that southern state would end. Congress eventually passed 2 more Reconstruction Acts to tighten up and clarify these procedures. And Arkansas became the first state to gain readmission in June 1868. And by July, enough states had ratified the 14th Amendment to make it a part of the Constitution. So the last southern state to qualify for readmission was actually Georgia, and they finally did so in July of 1870. So the South's refusal to accept Reconstruction and Johnson's intractability outraged the Republicans, and they became obsessed with their need to defeat him. And so Congress passed a series of measures between 1866 and 1868 that increased the authority of Congress over many of the areas of government. And still not satisfied, the Republicans took it a step further and tried to remove Johnson from office. And although Johnson wasn't a great president, he really hadn't done anything to be ejected from office. So the Republicans accused him of violating the Tenure of Office Act by dismissing Secretary of War Stanton. And really, he just wanted to get rid of Stanton because Stanton believed that the South should have to face harsh repercussions from the Civil War. And Johnson was being very lenient with the South. Stanton wanted him to be more harsh with the South. And so Johnson believed that Secretary of War Stanton was crippling his presidency. And so the Republicans accused him of violating the Tenure of Office Act because he tried to dismiss him without obtaining the Senate's approval. And as it turned out, Stanton finally just backed out of the picture anyway and resigned his post in May 26, 1868. So anyway, the House impeached Johnson, but they failed to gain enough of a majority to evict him from office. And so this was a time when Congress really overpowered the president. And we will go ahead and stop this video here, and we will pick up tomorrow with the 15th Amendment and Black Republicans in office.